Hi, my name's Kathy Knauer. I'm the Penfield Town Historian. On behalf of the Penfield Local History Room, Penfield Recreation, and the Penfield Library, I'd like to welcome you all. And I hope you're going to enjoy yourselves tonight hearing about the architecture of James H. Johnson. We have
Kathy, we can't hear back here.
How about now, Jay? So I'm going to introduce our speakers to you. Pam Mount from Penfield Recreation is also here. She's one of the people that helped me plan this. She's at the back. She's been wandering around looking like she knows what to do with this computer stuff, unlike me. So our presenters, this is a very good program. I've seen it before. And so our presenters are Katie Eggers
Como. Mm-hmm.
No.
She's the architectural historian at Barrow Architecture. She assists clients throughout Western New York with historic resource surveys, National Register nominations, and tax credit applications. She's a native of the Rochester area, has a BA in Humanities from Yale, and an MS in Historic Preservation from the University of Pennsylvania. After working for a few years at a preservation consulting firm in Washington, D.C., she moved back to Rochester to take a job at the Landmark Society of Western New York. She's also a trustee of the National Association for Olmsted Parks and frequently gives presentations on Rochester's Olmsted legacy. Our other presenter over here, Christopher Brandt, is an architect at Barrow Architecture, a firm with a legacy of over 40 years of historic preservation practice. He was born and raised in the Rochester region and has been active in its historic preservation community since high school. Chris received a BS in architecture from the University of Buffalo and a master's in architecture with a certificate in historic preservation from the University of Virginia. Outside of his day job restoring and adapting old buildings, he served as the advocacy and education coordinator of the Young Urban Preservationists, obsessive compulsively researches local history, and is DIY restoring the small historic home he shares with his wife. Wonder what he does in his spare time. So a couple things I wanted to point out to you. If you haven't had a chance to enjoy any snacks, refreshments, we have them in the back. If you have a cell phone, it would be great if you would turn it off so we don't have any interruptions. You probably saw on your way in, there are restrooms right outside the door and to your right there. And I wanted to also say, Mrs. Johnson, James Johnson's wife Sarah, and two of their daughters are here tonight. At this point, I'm going to turn the program over to our presenters.
Okay. All right, thanks for that nice introduction. We're so happy to be doing this presentation in Penfield because Penfield is where the Johnsons lived. And I think I meant to go back in our report and count it up. I think there are probably more Johnson buildings in Penfield than anywhere else. I'm not sure about that, but I think that might be the case. You'll see quite a few buildings that you recognize tonight, and possibly some that you never knew were Johnson buildings. So this project came about with the unfortunate loss of one of James Johnson's most important buildings a few years ago, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. And so there came an awareness when that happened that we really didn't have a good handle on what was out there from his career. Johnson was a very sweet and modest person who didn't go around tooting his own horn, and as a result he was just kind of quietly doing these amazing things and not getting usually a whole lot of publicity, with a few exceptions. So the Greece Historical Society sponsored us to do this project, where we spent a year and a half going back through his original drawings, his archives of slides, a lot of which you're going to see here tonight. Actually, let me put up my favorite one. And so it was a really unusual opportunity because he had passed away not too long before we started this, so everything was still in his office, everything was still as it was. We feel just so lucky that we got to do this project. It was really interesting and a lot of fun. So we tried the best we could, given all of this material, to identify what is still out there, including the well-known and an awful lot of not so well-known projects. We initially thought, oh, we'll find them all and then we'll go photograph them all. We didn't know that there were over 400 properties just in the Rochester area, so it's quite a lot. You're not going to see 400 things here. That would be too much. So this is James Johnson, and actually before I get started, does anyone here live or have lived in or owned a Johnson house? Obviously, the Johnson family members have. Anyone else? Okay, every now and then we get someone showing up who does have a Johnson building. So he was born in 1932 in Springfield, Missouri. His family was very involved in construction and real estate development in that area, and that gave him a lot of exposure at a young age to construction. He was very interested in hands-on building things himself, and thought that was kind of the way he was going to go, that he might go into contracting and construction. One of his uncles was an architect and one was a contractor, and they kind of said to him, you know, if you pursue architecture, you'll have a lot of options later on. And so that's what he ended up doing. He attended Drury College and then Oklahoma A&M. While he was there, he tended to always see things a little bit differently from the people around him. That's kind of an ongoing theme throughout his life, that he could see things in a different way. So he was, in school in the 50s, he would be with his classmates. They'd all be sort of designing things that looked kind of similar. He would be doing something completely different. This is on the right is a skyscraper design he did. It's actually very similar to something that Frank Lloyd Wright designed. So he was influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright throughout his career. He had the unusual opportunity, because of having these contractors in his family, to have one of his student projects built, which most people in their early 20s don't get to do. This was called the Pacesetter House in Springfield, and it was meant to be a prototype for a modern house. So it's very streamlined, kind of 1950s international style architecture. Very simple materials. He uses a lot of concrete, which is another theme we will see recurring. Flat roof. So a lot of strong geometry. That house is still standing. It's been very altered. I don't think you'd recognize it today if you saw it. It's in Springfield. He graduated in January 1956 and worked briefly with an architect named A. Blaine Immel, who was a student of Bruce Goff, who in turn was a student of Frank Lloyd Wright. And Chris is going to talk a little bit more about Bruce Goff. He was very into unusual kind of spiral and organic architectural forms. So while he hadn't been very impressed by his architectural studies, he really enjoyed working with Blaine Immel and meeting Bruce Goff a couple times. The other very important thing that happened in the spring of 1956 was that he married Sarah, who was with us here. And that was significant because after they lived in DC for a short period of time while he was fulfilling his ROTC commitment, he said, if you'll come with me for that, then we can go wherever you want for your graduate studies. And Sarah had a scholarship to come to Eastman School of Music. That's why they're here. So we have Sarah to thank for that. Well deserved. So when they came here, Jim worked at Bohackett and Flynn, which was a firm in downtown Rochester. He made some good friends there who he worked with throughout his life. He also got the opportunity to work on this project, which is at Our Lady of Mercy in Greece. And it's this building here is the one we're talking about first. This is the school that he did for them. And that's pretty typical of what you would see international style, again with strong geometry, simple materials, flat roof. He made connections at that time with Father Whalen, who was the priest of that parish. A few years later, Father Whalen wanted to have a parish hall built. They were a rapidly growing congregation. They needed to start kind of upgrading all their facilities, and so they were going to build a parish hall that would be their temporary kind of church, as well as a long-term meeting space. So he went back to Bohackett and Flynn and said he'd like to work with Johnson again, but by then he had left. So he went into the new firm where he was working and said, well, I'd like you to come and work for me. And he said, great, started his own firm, and pretty much never looked back. So the Parish Hall is this building here. So here's the school, here's the Parish Hall, and this is a building that we'll get to in a little bit. All right. So one of the things that's really interesting in the Parish Hall is that he started integrating modern art into his buildings. And this is a kind of a screen back behind the altar that he worked with a couple of artists, Kurt Feuerherm and the brothers James and Philip Sechrist, who worked with him on a number of projects that we'll look at. And so this was just kind of meant to block these big windows that they didn't want shining right in people's eyes while they were using it as the sanctuary. And so it's this very abstract, interesting ceramic piece. This is, I guess this is our first Penfield house. This is a house that he built for himself and Sarah, and eventually their 4 daughters lived there with them as well. This is the floor plan. It's not really ripply like that. These are supposed to be straight lines. It was just a rolled up drawing that we photographed as best we could.
He is modern.
Yeah. Well, just wait. So in the center, there's a garden space, and that's this space here that you see with one of the daughters. And that was an indoor garden with greenery that they had right in there. They had it as a garden initially, and then it became a play area for the girls. And then all the rooms were arranged around the outside. So there's a garage, a music room for Sarah, bedrooms, and then his office is down here. And that had a door so that he could, like a Dutch door, so he could open the door and keep an eye on the girls out in the atrium when Sarah was out doing her career. So, we don't have a picture of this house, but it is still there, very changed on the outside or on the inside, unfortunately. This was one of our favorite discoveries from early in his career. This is a house in Chilai for another couple who was living in the same apartment complex as the Johnsons before they built their house. And similar to their house on Browncroft Boulevard, this one has a very boxy character with a low-pitched hip roof and a skylight up in the top there, and uses a lot of concrete and natural wood. So simple materials put together in a very beautiful and elegant way. The people who live there loved this house. They were so excited to have us come and take a look at it. They're taking wonderful care of it. The only thing that's really there's only been a couple changes. One of them is that this space here was an indoor garden. So this was planted down below here, and that didn't work out very well. So previous owners changed that so that you have still kind of little niches where you could have plants, but the bottom part is not planted anymore. But other than that, they've really kept it very much the way it was. So in the mid-1960s, Johnson took a big leap with a couple of very high-profile projects. And this is the first one. This is St. John the Evangelist Church on West Ridge Road in Greece. So a number of his clients were religious organizations that were growing in the suburbs, and so they needed a new space. And often it was younger congregations wanted to express something very new and exciting with new modern architecture. So the original church that they had is still there. It's a little stone building right up on Ridge Road, and this is kind of down. If you've ever seen it, it's quite striking. So here's a construction photo, and I'm the historian, Chris is the architect. I'm going to do my best here to explain what's interesting about this from a more structural point of view. This is a kind of a concrete tube kind of coming down the middle, structural. And what he's done here is he's cut away part of that, which should be the part, supporting these massive roof beams. But Johnson worked with a very brilliant structural engineer, Ray DiPasquale, who when Johnson would come to him and say, I'd really like to do this cool thing where I want to have a big structural piece and then cut half of it out. Ray was someone who could figure out how to do that, because that shouldn't work, but they figured out how to make it work. You can see this is looking up from the ground, so you can see the scaffolding that's supporting all of this as these beams are going into this column that's been cut away. And here's how that is on the inside. It's a dramatic space. He was really interested in these incredible, dramatic interior spaces. Let's see, do we have another picture of this? Okay. And he also went further with this. When I mentioned from one of the previous projects that he was working with artists, he made that more and more a part of his practice so that the work of other artists from other disciplines was integrated more and more closely into his own work, so that architecture became sculpture and sculpture became architecture. So these works are by Wendell Castle, and he had several times he collaborated with Wendell Castle. This is Carl Zolo was a metal artist who did Stations of the Cross as well as some work with the baptistry. And then he worked with the Sechrist and Kurt Feuerherm again on this altar screen, I guess you'd call that, which is a big ceramic piece that they came up with this process for casting this enormous piece. And then over to the right there, you see his first example where he's working with those artists, Sechrist and Kurt Feuerherm, on this sand cast process, which had been around for a long time in sculpture, but was something new in architecture at that time. So what they did is Kurt would create these ceramic pieces that were put into a mold. So this is actually a mock-up in the studio of how they did it. They ended up doing it out on the actual construction site. So they would dig into the ground, put these ceramic pieces face down in this mold, and then pour the concrete over it. The concrete would dry, and they'd pick the pieces up so that they formed the outside wall here with the pieces into them. So this was their first experiment with this process, and they took this farther and farther and farther, as you'll see. So his second, well, I should say for this one, he won the Lillian Fairchild Award from the University of Rochester, which is given to an artist from any discipline who creates the most notable work of art in the year. So he got an award for St. John the Evangelist for that. So that was one that he did get a lot of attention, but his project that got the most attention at the time probably was the Liberty Pole. A lot of people probably didn't know he did the Liberty Pole. We've seen it, very often. This was an interesting project. It was the smallest urban renewal project in the United States. It was just like a fraction of an acre. And this little parcel, if you've seen the Liberty Pole, you know it sits on a little triangle, had buildings on it that were all cleared. And the city of Rochester and the federal government set up a design competition, the first time there'd ever been a design competition in Rochester, to find someone to design a piece of art of some sort that would go onto that little parcel. And there were very particular criteria because they didn't want people walking over to see it up close, because at that time there were streets all the way around. Now one of the streets has been cut off, but at that time it's a little triangle surrounded by a ton of traffic. They didn't really want to, have people crossing the street willy-nilly. So it was something that was meant to look good at all times of the year, look good from across the street or from more of a distance, but maybe not something that people would go up and touch. And so they had entries from all over the country. They had 123 anonymous entries. And Johnson, the night before it was due, stayed up all night and thought about what he wanted to do, and then had this idea for this Liberty Pole. That's something that's tied to the history of the site. There had been Liberty Poles, I'm not sure if they were on that exact site, but in that vicinity previously. That was kind of a patriotic American thing that happened in some cities. They'd put up these poles. So he came up with this idea, and he integrated an idea that we saw with St. John the Evangelist. I didn't point it out at the time, but in that case it was a roof, and in this case it's these cables, that all these cables are actually straight. When you look at it, it looks like they're curved, because he had a way of kind of arranging them to give the impression of a curve, and he did this with roofs a lot. We'll see some more examples of that. So it's a simple metal pole with this structure of these cables that gives kind of the impression of a billowing sail or something like that. So here's a recent photo and some of his sketches for that. Oh. So it was controversial. There were a lot of people who thought that perhaps there should be a tree or some figural kind of a sculpture, but he was very devoted to this idea and very firm that this was appropriate to the space. This is, the jury chose it anonymously from these chose it unanimously from 123 entries. And you know, he had a lot of defenders too who said, you know, you're not supposed to pick art by letters to the editor, people who want trees. It's, you know, a qualified professional jury has picked this, and this is the right thing for the site. And I think today we'd all agree it is the right thing for the site. You don't really hear a lot of people complaining about it anymore. The plaza was changed, as I said. The streets used to go around all three sides. When they changed the one side of it so that it's now a pedestrian area, Johnson was involved in that conversation and how to best kind of rethink that. His original design included, this is a sculptural piece that was a fountain in the summer and was supposed to shoot flames in the winter. It actually did not work that well, strangely enough. And there was a whole kind of a sculpture garden, kind of sunken garden at the base of it that also wasn't very successful. It kind of became a little bit unsightly with lack of maintenance over time. So he helped with the whole redesign of all of that to make it more appropriate to the site as it is today. So this is an example of something where even when he was given a sort of modest commission, he managed to make it really interesting. And I wish I should take a picture with the whole plaza, but to the left here is an existing commercial plaza that he was asked to design an addition. And it was a very ordinary little flat-roofed plaza, and this is what he added onto there as a little, I think it was a liquor store originally. It's a hair salon today. So he really liked these, you know, interesting. He could have just extended the plaza the way it was, but he went with this much more dramatic and interesting form. So all around our community, and especially here in Penfield, there are things that you would never really guess were designed by an architect of this caliber. Here's some houses in Penfield. You may have seen them. They wouldn't necessarily stand out to you as having been designed by someone as notable as Johnson, but he did a lot of kind of ordinary houses for you know, working for developers or for families who needed a nice kind of regular kind of house. But even these have their own like interesting little touches. Like this is a very wide chimney, and that's the kind of thing that Frank Lloyd Wright would do. So he liked to bring in these unusual, you know, they definitely are not kind of run-of-the-mill houses exactly like all the others. They do stand out a little bit, but you probably wouldn't necessarily know that it was someone like James Johnson. All right, so after he had experimented at St. John the Evangelist with this Earthcast Concrete technique, he really took to that. He thought that was a really interesting way to design buildings. He always loved concrete. He talked about how it was this amazing material that you could sculpt it into any kind of form. You could do all kinds of things with it. He felt that it was very economical and very practical and just the perfect material for the modern day. So whenever he had a chance, he would try to convince his clients to let him do more of these experimental buildings with the Earthcast concrete. And this is the first one where it was really kind of the central to the way the building was built. This is Our Lady of Mercy Rectory in Greece. This is going back to where he had done the school and the parish hall. This is the third building on that campus. So what happened there was that Father Whalen, who had become a friend and a wonderful client for him, really liked the Johnson's house with the central atrium that I showed you before. And he wanted something similar to that for the priests. He thought that would be the perfect kind of relaxing retreat for them. And so he asked him to design something similar, and so he did. And so there you have again that central garden room with the rooms for the priests arranged around it. And this shows, these are pictures that I think he took himself of the construction process, where on the bottom here they've built the mold and put the texture that they want into the ground with the frame. They pour the concrete in, let it cure, and then lift those panels up to form the walls. So a very interesting process there. And this was, you know, because Father Whalen wanted that same kind of floor plan as the Johnson's house, it was an interesting combination of this very new technique with regular kind of ordinary square geometry. You don't see a lot of square buildings in Johnson after this, but this one was square in plan, but quite unusual in terms of those exterior walls. So here again is that picture of the whole campus with the school, the parish hall, and the rectory. He didn't design the church, on that site, but he did these other 3. Unfortunately, that campus has been vastly changed, so the school and the Parish Hall are pretty much unrecognizable now. And unfortunately, this is the building that was lost. The rectory is the one that was demolished in, I think it was 2012. And it's really a shame because it was the first in a series of 6 extraordinary earthcast concrete buildings. This is the second one. This is St. Januarius. My children call this the Pineapple Church. It wasn't meant to be a pineapple. It was meant to resemble in plan, so if you're looking at it from space, it looks like a grape leaf, kind of. And that's meant to kind of evoke the history of Naples with the vineyards and things. So on the right, you see their previous church. I always wonder about these congregations who were in a building like that on the right, and then the priest says, guess what, we're getting a new building, and they get this on the left. I think when the people we've talked to tended to love it. I mean, I think this was a time, the 60s, when people wanted to have something new and interesting and kind of set themselves apart. So I think a lot of these people did really love them. So again, we have the earthcast concrete process here, where these were formed right on the site. The panels were made, the glass set right into them, and then lifted up to create the walls. And what's interesting that they managed to do here is the exterior and the interior of these panels are totally different. So when you see it from the outside, it looks like these little tiny piercings. On the inside, it's kind of these deep cavities here where all the light kind of shines through and is amplified by the effect of having it set in so deep like that. And that's how it looks today. We talked to Peter Romeo, who was an associate of his. They had a partnership for a few years around this time. And he said that what he really loved about this building was that at least he couldn't really anticipate what it was going to look like when it was done in terms of the effect of the light, the way it changes throughout the day, and you get kind of a changing color spectrum as the sun moves. I bet Jim Johnson knew it was going to do that, but Peter said he didn't really. He was pleasantly surprised when he saw how that one turned out. So this is Temple Sinai in the town of Brighton. It's one of 2 2 Johnson buildings in the town of Brighton that are locally designated landmarks. There are 3 locally designated landmarks by Johnson overall, the 3rd one being the Mushroom House, but the other 2 are in Brighton. So Temple Sinai was another one of these young, growing congregations. They had split off from one of the other temples, and it was a bunch of young families, really wanted to do something new and different and kind of establish their place with a signature building. So they hired Johnson to do this. Now this part over here is a more recent addition that's, I think, very compatible with the building. But the original building is this, the sanctuary space, and then wrapping around here is the education wing. And those are all part of the original design. So the drawings, I think it's always interesting to look at these drawings, because as a non-architect, I find it hard to imagine from these drawings just how rugged and organic the building actually ends up looking. The drawings make it look a little more sterile, and they don't quite give the sense of how it actually came out, at least to me. And here is that going together. It's made of these 10 huge, I think each one being 2-ton ribs that were cast in place on the site, or cast in the earth right on the site, and then again lifted into place. We have a video we'll show you in a second about how that was done. All the furnishings up at the front were by Wendell Castle again, and then they have this kind of skylight up at the top that, you're looking right up at the sky. So really it brings, if you've ever been there, you know that you feel like you're inside and outside at the same time. It's really a marvelous space. All right, I think, okay. So I'm going to hand it over to Chris, who's going to sort of narrate the video and take us from there.
Okay, everyone hear me? Or even better, can everyone hear me if I don't use the mic? Darn, I was hoping. Okay, so what we're seeing, so you can see a couple of the large panels there sitting outside of their molds. You can see this is sort of the education wing that sort of wraps around the temple, and then down there at the bottom of the screen are some of the panels still in their earthen molds before being tipped up into place. And the visual trick that Johnson plays with how the building's constructed is that hidden in the framing of that skylight are structural steel tubes that hold these massive panels apart from one another, but they're integrated into the composition of the skylight, so it becomes this sort of, at first glance, a sort of impossible construction of how could these massive panels not just collapse on one another with nothing but glass between them. And so because the panels were so large, it was a two-crane operation. And so there was a large crane sort of lifting the panel up, and then a smaller crane controlling the bottom that would sort of swing the bottom out and set it into the sort of the foundation pocket that they sort of sit into in the ground. And a local architect here in Rochester, Craig Jensen, who has sort of been active for many decades, one of his favorite things about this building and about Johnson's method of doing earthen cast molds is that since every mold was handmade, it has its own inherent imperfections due to them being handmade and not being sort of stamped out of metal, but also because of using literally dirt and mud. And to him, and I think to a lot of people, that sort of slight variation adds a great deal of depth and sort of intrigue to the buildings, so that they aren't made out of these repetitive parts. They really do sort of feel very much of their site and have that sort of inherent character to them, even though, in some ways he's sort of unitizing these things, but no two are the same. And so there's a couple of little anecdotes about some of Jim's projects, and one of the anecdotes that we like to tell about this project, you can see the steel here holding. There's that steel bar going out that would hold it apart. So these projects were barrier pushing. They were beyond the realm of normal architecture or normal structures, and they were occasionally dangerous. And so with Temple Sinai, like Katie had mentioned, Jim was always very hands-on in construction. So his uncle owned a large concrete plant. Another uncle was an architect. His grandfather was a major developer in Springfield. So he always wanted to be sort of hands-on in his construction projects, even though he was an architect, which sort of blurs the barrier a little bit between contractor and architect, which is sort of not really kosher nowadays. But so when they were getting ready to set the last pair of these panels with that sort of steel bar holding apart, each panel has a little pin that you set for that sort of steel bar to hold apart. And Jim wanted to climb up the scaffolding and set the last pin between the panel and the steel. And Jim was up on the scaffolding and motioned for the crane operator to begin to slowly bring in that massive, multi-ton piece of concrete in, and he got his hand pinned between that concrete panel and the steel and actually ripped the webbing right out of his hand and had to be taken to the hospital. But because Jim had unbridled energy and dedication to his projects, the instant he got stitches and wrapped his hand back up, he refused to go back home and went right back to the construction site that same day with his hand all wrapped up. So the next project in the earthen cast buildings, there are two buildings in this sort of series that were what I'll call not unitized, but instead were one massive monolithic concrete pour. And so Penfield Presbyterian Church is the sort of first one we're going to show you that. So instead of making a series of molds from which semi-regular pieces are assembled into a building, this is an entire building molded and poured at once. And it was extremely daring. This is sort of, I probably would say, this is like the most out there of his projects. And unfortunately, this is also probably the least successful of the earthen cast projects. So the original design, as sort of seen in this sketch, and then sort of seen in this model photograph, was a sort of large upturned sort of lily flower. With the original design being that each petal of the lily would contain different functions for Penfield Presbyterian Church, whether it be offices, kindergarten, rectory, and then in the center was to be this the main sanctuary of the parish with this massive sort of 90-foot ceiling that was lit from above. You can imagine the sort of drama of that sort of swooping up interior space with the sort of bare concrete walls. But because of budget constraints, the throat of the flower was never built. And this is one of the few photographs we were able to find in our research that shows the building sort of right after construction, so you can see the petals, and you see that they're sort of cut off instead of, the flower really would have been up here if it were completed as originally intended. So the intent was to, when budgets allowed in the future, to complete the flower, but that never happened, and that led to a series of problems with with roof leaks that could sort of never be solved, and resulted, as I can tell from some of the giggles, that some people know what happened. And what happened is that an entire separate superstructure was built over the top of the flowers with its own separate roof. But Jim, sort of always being a humble man with a great sense of humor, the first time I met him, he told me sort of gleefully that he had a rather unique distinction as an architect, that he had a entombed building, and he thought that he was probably the only architect he knew that possibly had a entombed building to his resume. So Jim was not involved in doing the superstructure here, but it sort of took his licks with a great sense of humor. But if you go into the interior, you can still see very much the sort of original rough concrete texture with these sort of floating globes of light, and then you can see where the sort of petals come down onto these pillars. So we've got a little construction video here that'll sort of help to understand what they were doing here. So instead of just digging these sort of panelized molds, so what they did here for this, the sort of what I'll call this sort of earthwork castings, is that the columns were cast first and had their footers put in, and then dirt was pushed up around those columns, and then this sort of perimeter wall that would have formed the original sanctuary, and then that dirt was sculpted into this massive flower mold, and then you can see it's sort of in various, varying layers of rough to more finished. And as they got, they started with bulldozers, then you have men with rakes starting to get the topography of that dirt just right, and then the final is actually molding it by hand to sort of create some of the sort of veins that you see on the sort of flower petals in that one photograph. I'm just going to jump forward because we get two videos. So after they formed all that dirt, then you have a massive web of steel reinforcing bars that are laid over that dirt before the concrete's poured in. And then in one day, concrete truck after concrete truck after concrete truck after concrete truck, I think for almost nearing on 24 hours, because there were no expansion joints and there were no breaks. This had to be a continuous casting to be structurally sound. They cast the entire building in one fell swoop, and then after they're done casting, they dig the earth back out. So you can see the scale of it, and if you've ever been to the building, you know the scale of it. This is massively ambitious to cast a building of this size all at once. I guess I'll tell the anecdote about this building. So. Like I noted before, there were some issues with the roof leaks, but an anecdote about, again, the trials and tribulations that come with pushing the envelope so much, is that when they were digging the earth back out, there was a large boulder that had sort of glued itself to the underside of the flower petals, because the casting was done in late fall, and by the time they got all the dirt out, it sort of had become winter, and so some of the moisture inherent in the soil had actually sort of frozen the boulder to the underside of the flower. And to make these sort of massive sort of vaults work, that concrete's actually only about 3 or 4 inches thick. It's not very thick. If it were very thick and be very heavy, it would never stand up. And so Jim directed one of the sort of bulldozers to come over and try to knock the boulder off of the ceiling of the casting. And he was watching while leaning on a column and felt the building move as they hit one of the boulders, and they said, stop, we're not going to knock it off. And so they set a couple fires underneath the boulder to sort of melt the ice and get the boulder to fall to the ground. So this is the other earthwork casting that's part of the sort of series of dirt cast projects. This is the Airplane House. It's the original clients were sort of looking for an architect to build their sort of their home out in the suburbs. And they interviewed a lot of different architects, some names you may recognize, like Don Hershey, Olga Valvano, but they weren't necessarily really impressed with too many of them. But on a recommendation from a friend, the friend told them that, because you're so far out in the country, you might want to be interested in building a fireproof house. And they had become aware of Jim's work in doing these sort of solid concrete buildings, and so hired Jim to design this beautiful home that they still live in to this day. It's like unchanged on the interior. It was amazing when Katie and I got to go see it. But it's the same. It's in the town of Victor, and that's the most amount of detail I will tell you, unfortunately. But it was the sort of same method that we saw with Penfield Presbyterian. The interesting thing was that the original lot was a sort of flat farm field. So one of the ancillary benefits of doing this earthwork casting is that you actually were able to create more drama with this sort of artificial topography from being able to resculpt the earth as you dug it out from the casting of the house. Here's a couple photos. This is a period photograph. So this is sort of so the house sits several hundred feet off the road, and this is sort of the approach that you see when you come down the driveway. Well, these trees are obviously much larger today, but the house sort of comes down and creates this sort of sheltering cave that you enter into, and then the whole house sort of opens out to the landscape behind it. And then last but not least, the most famous and most daring of his Earthcast works is obviously the Mushroom House. And so this is going back to now making molds in the dirt, sort of unitizing, and then assembling those parts into a building. But you could maybe begin to imagine that it might be a little impossible to create, this ovoid pod in one piece. So each of these is actually two separate molds that were joined together after they had been cast into the dirt, and we'll sort of see that there. So, and the sort of what I'll call the porch pod, that sort of shows you, the one half of the pod casting, and then you had the sort of roof half that encapsulated the pods that are conditioned to the interior. And so we have this dramatically wooded site with a lot of great topography, very difficult to get to, and the molds, again, sort of you can see the two of them here. And both photographs sort of dug directly into the dirt, formed by hand. You have these sort of decorative elements, hearkening to the inspiration for the design of the house. Does anyone know what flora inspired this house? And it's not mushrooms. Queen Anne's lace. Thank you. Yeah, so that was the original inspiration. In the recountings of the original owners, the Antells, Mark Antell recounted how when first meeting with Jim to discuss the design of the house, he sort of exclaimed that, I've come up with the idea for your house, just hold on a minute. And he ran over and grabbed a couple of Queen Anne's lace flowers, handed one to each of his clients and himself, and had them touch them at the edges and said, that's your house. And I thought that was, groovy and great. What a, sort of wonderful and interesting idea for it. And so some of that direct design inspiration of Queen Anne's lace is sort of lost because of a construction problem that was encountered when assembling these. So the original design intent was that every pod, when you walked into it, would look like the underside of Queen Anne's lace with multiple of these arching tendrils, like you would see underneath the canopy of a Queen Anne's lace flower, flowing up towards the ceiling. If you've ever seen photos of this house or gone on a couple of the public tours that have come around, you'll know that only one of the pods has that ceiling. And that's because that design added a lot of weight to the second half of the mold. And because of the difficulty, like I said, the site was very hard to get to. The original crane operator was not willing to send the crane of the size specified by Jim, and so sent a smaller crane. And that smaller crane was no match for the top half of the pod that had those tendrils, and actually tipped over into the valley, and they had to sort of release that pod and break it. There's some construction footage that actually shows sort of those shards in the valley as the house is being constructed around it. And so they were successfully able to get one that had those sort of beautiful tendrils, but then made adjustments to lighten up the load because there was no way they were going to get the larger crane in. So they had to design around the capacity of the crane that was available to assemble them. So you can see them here in the two parts. So the piece of them have this sort of temporary superstructure because they had to sort of have a temporary support while you tied them together, you can sort of see poking out here. So there's a whole web of reinforcing running through this concrete. And these ribs express the actual sort of the density and structural sort of beams that are inherent. And that's where you actually have these sort of almost continuous rings of reinforcement that run around these pods. And so the reinforcing bars sort of stuck out at either end. You can see them here, and they're sort of meshed together to tie the whole thing into this very taut sort of tensile structure. And then that's sort of covered over with concrete to cover that sort of that transition point. But it creates an inherently very, very strong structure once you get it together. But the problem is sort of getting the parts together first. And so that's the interior of the living room pod. This has that original design intent for the ceiling, but again, I mean, you can see all the concrete that's here, because this column is not structural. You know, that's just this decorative piece of concrete. So you imagine the amount of weight that's adding to the design. The original wife, Marg Antel, was also a artist that Jim collaborated with frequently, and Marg made all of the tile seen throughout the house, as well as a lot of the tile that's seen in the addition that he did to the house in 2002. That's a picture of it complete. Okay, so in doing this project, we struggled a little bit in how to categorize Jim's work. Because usually when you're sort of doing a survey project like this, you have some sort of regular method of categorization, whether it's single family, multifamily, commercial, like programmatic uses of buildings, or single story, 2-story, 3-story, form-based. And what we ended up sort of landing on is that really what sort of worked best for us was a sort of odd hybrid where we had some programmatic use, and then we were able to sort of break up his more striking organic designed buildings into 3 subcategories. So that first 6 that we saw, that's the sort of most distinctive, most significant, the earthen cast buildings. And then we have 2 subcategories after that for his organic design buildings. One which is sculptural, so we'll see that, and then we'll also have geometric organic design. So organic architecture is sort of founded by Frank Lloyd Wright, and it's sort of a twofold way of thinking about architecture. One is deriving inspiration from nature in a sort of more literal way, where you have these sort of sinuous, doubly curved surfaces, or like we saw in some of Jim's buildings, maybe even a direct representation of like the church as a grape leaf. Or with St. January's, the colors that we saw in St. January's are representative of the different grape varietals. So that's more of a direct homage or direct sort of visual interpretation of a natural form. And there's the other half of it is sort of abstraction of nature and seeing repetitive geometry. So Frank Lloyd Wright did a lot of that with his Usonian homes, where he had sort of repeating hexagons like you might see in a beehive, or the sort of repeating shapes you might see in sort of leaf cells, and understanding nature in that sort of abstract repetition but variation of a similar form. And so Jim sort of played in both of those. And Bruce Goff was sort of very influential on him. If you look up any of Bruce Goff's buildings in Oklahoma, they have a lot of these sort of very daring, very experimental structures that use odd materials in interesting ways, a lot of spiraling roofs, and sort of a lot of drama to his buildings. And I think Jim was definitely significantly affected and inspired by meeting Mr. Goff a couple times when he was a young man. So this is the second landmark designated building in the town of Brighton, the Norwegian House. This I sort of, a quick way of thinking about it is maybe saying, you know, if you took Temple Sinai and made it a house, it was built essentially the same year. It has the same interest in having this sort of continuous skylight between these sort of roof surfaces, but instead of concrete, a material that Jim loved to use a lot was cedar shingles. Unfortunately, the house was re-roofed a couple of years ago, but the cedar shingles that originally would have been on the outside, but they also wrapped to the inside, and you'll see that here in a couple of interior photographs where the whole sort of swooping form of the roof is clad in that cedar shingles. And then what's also sort of interesting to me, some of his early projects in the 60s, Jim had an interest in traditional Japanese architecture. So his original house, as well as the Our Lady of Mercy Rectory, are both based on a traditional Japanese courtyard house, where you have that sort of central courtyard around which a perimeter of rooms are arranged. And so with this house, you see a little bit of that influence still, where we have this sort of boxy, low, single-story sort of massing, and and sort of in some of the exterior photographs, you'll see that sort of pared back detailing. So you can see the beautiful roof structure swooping upward. And then, like a lot of his more significant commercial and public buildings, we have, again, collaboration with frequent artist collaborators. So this is a Seacrest Brothers concrete panel. And though it looks like a reflection here, there's actually a matching panel to it on the inside. Again, cast in the dirt on site, but in this case it's only really just a decorative element. We're not building the building out of it in this case. And then another decorative panel, which has now been incorporated into a new kitchen island, used to be a sort of dividing wall as part of the original design for this house. And so when you come around to the back side, you can sort of see this more pared down, this sort of white stucco and dark trim. And that's where I sort of see that waning interest in traditional Japanese architecture, that sort of pared down horizontal compositions with these sort of Asian-influenced roof lines. This is a number of people's favorite house. It may have been Katie and I's favorite house to see. Jean France, the esteemed architecture historian here in Rochester, this was Jean's favorite Jim Johnson house. She was really floored the first time she ever saw it. The Schwartz House. So essentially the house is a J in plan, if you can imagine the letter J if you're looking down at the house. And the roof starts at a sort of just a gradual shed slope. So, you know, it's higher on one side, lower on the other, just like that. And then as you go down the J, the roof tips further and further and further up until it spirals around here at the end, creating sort of dramatic, doubly curved surface. And in that dramatic space is the living room looking out to the woods beyond. So you can sort of see, if you're looking out there, so you can see the end of the J there, and as it's ascending in slope, and then again, we have these cedar shingles on the outside that come to the inside to create this beautiful curving monolithic surface under which the sort of living areas are arranged. This is it today. The current owners adore their house. It still has all its great original cedar shingles. Oh, we don't have a current interior photo, but I assure you it looks very similar to what I showed you in the historic photographs. Another interesting house that we came across, this one's probably almost unique in his oeuvre of work. So this looks like concrete, but it's not. So it appears at first to be like that earthen form concrete. Katie would say this is the real mushroom house. It definitely looks like a mushroom. But what's actually going on here, so there's a heavy timber sort of base. You can see this sort of poking out of the bottom. And then he cantilevered the structure out to hold these very light walls, which he made out of spray foam. So they actually sort of sprayed onto a wood, sort of light wood superstructure to create this dramatic sculptural form, but to keep it very light, because they were only sort of building with wood on this hard to access site near the Hunt Hollow ski resort. This is the only church outside of Rochester that he did. He was one of 3 architects asked to submit designs by the Buffalo Diocese. The other 2 architects were from Buffalo, but our hometown boy won out and designed this sort of very striking building. It's sort of in the shape of a flying dove from on top. And although it's very sculptural and very regular, this was not sort of cast in dirt. This was a more conventional method of casting. Obviously, the end result is not conventional, but the formwork was made out of wood and metal panels that were sort of assembled on site vertically into this sort of complex shape with these sort of curved indentations, and then all cast from on top instead of in the dirt and then assembling pieces. And that's the underside, so you can sort of see. So he's doing the same sort of trick here, like Katie had mentioned with the Liberty Pole. With a lot of the houses with the Schwartz residence, where the structural members of the roof are all straight but by varying their angle. And then as you apply finish layers to that, they begin to approximate a complex doubly curved surface. So you can see that here, this sort of billowing roof. And then what's just out of view is that aligning with this vertical stained glass window behind the altar is a continuous skylight that runs from here all the way back, sort of dividing that roof, but then cleverly hiding the massive steel beams that hold up the roof that rest on these giant sort of concrete columns, again, that are sort of hidden. They just look like little breaks in the wall.
Who did the windows?
I don't know who did the windows for this one. So this church in particular actually was a little bit of a break for a lot of his artist collaborators. Kurt Feuerherm and Seacrest Brothers still worked with him on one object, which was not in this photo, but is in the historic photo. It was this beautiful altar screen of the sort of tensile steel cables and glass discs. But the stained glass, as well as all the altar furniture, was executed by Buffalo artists. So Jim actually reached out to artists from the Buffalo area to collaborate in the building instead of just taking his whole Rochester crew with him, which I thought was rather nice. But unfortunately, like I mentioned, the altar screen has been lost, as well as all of the altar furniture, except for the sort of carved granite altar is still there. Phyllis Wheatley Library here in Rochester is the only library. The second of 3 buildings that he did that were part of urban renewal projects, so the first one being the Liberty Pole, Phyllis Wheatley Library being the second, and you'll see his sort of last church that he did was the sort of 3rd urban renewal project that he was involved in with some participation with the city. So this, sort of like St. John of Lockport, this was not an earth-cast building, but it was a very sort of out there conventionally cast concrete building. You have these sort of masses of concrete between which the sort of billowing roof is sort of in between, sheltering the main sort of reading room. You can sort of see the steel structure there, and then these sort of concrete masses. And you can see in this photo, you actually begin to see a little bit of what's going on, is that he worked with the Seegers brothers to develop an interesting and perhaps environmentally hazardous way of casting concrete. Is they used hot pickaxes and pieces of metal to melt styrofoam to create a oddly patterned concrete formwork within which they cast the concrete. And it creates this beautiful texture with all these sort of round circles interwoven with almost look like sort of like algae in a way, sort of, or kelp weaving through. It's a really sort of beautiful surface. Although what sort of always got me and Kate is when we were looking in the news, the sort of news coverage for the library, there certainly was coverage about, sort of excitement about Jim being involved. But when it opened, there was like no talk about the architecture. What they were so fascinated with was the acoustic treatment of the ceilings. So because it had this sort of billowing concrete ceiling, they designed this idea of sort of essentially hanging fabric or carpet to deaden the sound. And that was like all the newspaper could talk about was the carpeted ceiling in the new branch library, and like nothing else about the architecture. But it's still a very striking building to today, and it's largely unaltered except for that sort of billowing ceiling is now hidden by a sort of dropped acoustic tile ceiling. But other than that, the vast majority of this building is still very original to its design. St. Christopher Church in Chili. St. Christopher's, as well as a number of his other buildings, something that I think sometimes gets missed with Jim because his buildings are so avant-garde and challenging to you as being a sort of, being beyond what you think a normal building is that he did think very deeply about the inherent metaphors that he was designing for, especially with his religious buildings, as well as the desires of his clients and the parishes or temples he was designing for. So, and he was very much a student of religious architecture. He actually gave lectures on it during his career. And so with Temple Sinai is a building laden with metaphors. It is the overall form is a tent, representative of the sort of traveling history and the Jews sort of being without a home as you sort of read throughout the Torah and in the Bible if you're a Christian. And then that tent is made of 10 tablets, representative of the 10 tribes of Israel. The sort of 2 pylons that stand free from the temple are representative of the 2 tablets of the 10 commandments. The desire for Temple Sinai to not have the floor touch the walls, so you're actually sort of floating in this sort of space that you are continually connected to the sky above you. It's meant to represent the sort of continuous loop of life in Judaism instead of sort of the Christianity of being in one place and going to another. So I just want to sort of emphasize that he, for a lot of these buildings, although unfortunately we weren't necessarily able to get all those details out of him, but we did get some details on some of the buildings, is that he really did think very deeply about these buildings, about how he came up with a finished design. So I think St. Christopher's is actually a pretty easy one to see. So if you know the sort of the story of St. Christopher in Christian mythology, is that St. Christopher carried the Christ child across the raging waters of a river. And so it's not too hard to see this sort of human-like figure bearing a sort of what looks like a heavy load because they're leaning back across in this sort of the spiraling wave-like structure around it. And it creates a very dramatic space on the interior. Again, the building would have originally been clad in the cedar shingles that you see on the inside, creating that sort of undulated, faceted wave form that spirals up to sort of one of Jim's sort of signature sort of top-down sky-lit altar spaces. And that's sort of looking out the other direction. You can see the sort of faceting structure of the waves surrounding the sort of the human figure above the altar. This is Jim's second house that he designed for his family, not too far from their first house, and in the town of Penfield. This is a great house that sort of is deceiving in size. You see that a lot where you have these big sculptural eye-catching roofs that they might actually sort of hide the mass of the building. So you notice that there's no second floor windows visible here. And it's a very sort of private front. I think I've always loved the sort of entrances to the house. It almost feels like Hobbit-like. It's very sort of storybook, but again, it has this wonderful undulating form. There is no sort of flat surface to be found. And then the house sort of opens up dramatically to the back, as you can see here, as the roof spirals around, and they have these series of dormers overlooking the wooded area and golf course beyond. The tile work seen here in the living room was done by Mara Gantel. It's like I mentioned, Jim constantly sort of tried to maintain his relationships with his artist collaborators throughout his career, and not just in some of those signature buildings that we saw earlier. Okay, now on to the third and sort of final subcategory for the organic design, the geometric. This is a fun house in Brighton. My probably favorite part about it is that it has a drawbridge. You see the chains here? Always a bit of whimsy with Jim. I'm not sure why, but why not would be my answer. But so this one's not, this is maybe a little more typical for Jim. It obviously still has a lot of drama to it. It is actually all single-story living, so these windows allow for light to deeply penetrate into the plan of the building, create dramatic double height spaces, but there actually is no sort of second floor living in this house. But some of the ones that are more obviously sort of these more abstract geometric designs, probably one of my favorites is Temple Beth Am. This is the smallest sacred space he ever designed. It's in Henrietta. The story with this congregation was another young congregation, but they actually had already built a temple for themselves about 1964 or 1965. But their temple, along with a couple of other Jewish sites, were bombed in I think in 1971 or 1972. And Jim reached out and offered to provide his services free to design a new sanctuary for them after theirs had been sort of stolen from them and destroyed. And I find that sort of very touching that he would have done that. And so for me, again, I was never able to ask Jim what he was thinking about for this, but there's obviously this sort of peaked form, or what I really see as sort of a cloaked figure with a cloak sort of dragging behind them. And in a way, it has a very sheltering sense of place to me, and it's sort of a shelter or a safe space to be in, I think, which is very fitting given the history that led up to the construction of this structure. And that's it today. And this was the only one we weren't able to get into, unfortunately. Through change of ownership, we were never able to get anyone to pick up a phone to let us into it. So I do not have any interior photographs for you. It was operated as a temple until 2010, I think. And then it was maybe vacant for a year or two at most. And now it's run by a smaller, I think it's a Ukrainian Christian church in Henrietta. But we tried, but we couldn't get a phone call back to get in. So.
I don't think they're still actually using it. They still own it.
And then last but not least, for public commissions was AME Zion Church. This is the oldest African American Christian congregation in Rochester. This was the same congregation that Frederick Douglass published his North Star newspaper in the basement. And this is their fourth church. And it was built because their church at the time, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, was under threat for demolition for the inner loop. And at the very last moment, that church was saved, but it was already far beyond, since the congregation had moved out and built new digs for themselves that they could be housed in. So it does. Their older church does still stand, but they were able to save some of their sort of signature stained glass windows from the original church and incorporated them into the design of the new church. And Jim was always one for drama, even when you had a sort of limited budget, but it has a sort of great pyramidal form with that sort of undulating roof behind it that essentially serves the sort of classroom and offices sort of drag up behind it. And then you have this sort of dramatic thrust skyward over the sanctuary space. Like a lot of his sacred spaces, this is all Wendell Castle furniture. Again, collaborating with Mr. Castle, again, one of his most frequent artist collaborators. And then again, this dramatic lift skyward. And then at the back side, as it comes down, these are the dedicatory stained glass windows from the old church that feature Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass, significant members of their congregation, and were incorporated front and center. If you've ever been to this church, when you enter into the front doors, the first thing you see are the stained glass windows, lit from the light inside the sanctuary before you actually enter the sanctuary. This is the Cates House. This is probably is this the last one in this category, I think? And this is a very dramatic site, not in concrete, but even with wood, Jim sort of pushed the barrier, and it sits over a wooded ravine of Irondequoit Creek, and has a sort of multiple sort of 3-story structure. And although it's sort of very open out to the woods, similar to his own house and like the Schwartz House from the public street side, the only thing you're seeing is one lone window through a singular mass of a roof that originally, like you can see in some of these historic photographs, was all covered in cedar shingles. That's the sort of interior. So this is looking out that window there. And so the glass wraps up in this sort of faceted ribbon all the way up to a sort of third story, what I'll call like a tree house. It's a sort of reading that looks down onto this living room, 25 feet below, and looks out into the wooded ravine beyond. So, like I said, we had different categories. Now we're into a programmatic use category because we just couldn't quite figure out how to fit his multifamily projects into the project. And so, probably his most significant and one that I think was maybe as daring as some of his buildings we saw earlier was the housing systems company that he founded with a few investors, as well as one of his employees, Thomas Hamilton. And the design essentially was, has anyone sort of heard recently about sort of fad of 3D printing a house? And you can just use one arm and it just prints out a house. Well, Jim was, about 45 years ahead of his time. His idea was to essentially make an elaborate mold within which you would cast an entire housing unit with all the electrical, the plumbing, the windows, and the door frames. And you would lift that housing unit and just set it on its foundation, and then cast the next one, set it on its foundation. And so the only built complex of these that was sort of a proof of concept is the Fairport Apartments. Unfortunately, about 6 or 7 years ago, they were significantly altered. Now you wouldn't even notice that they were there. They're simple by virtue of needing to have that sort of finite of a mold, and then sort of to make it sort of one-up it more daring, and in an effort to make it affordable, you were supposed to be able to cast these on site with this elaborate mold. And so they made a movable factory with 2 giant gantry cranes that picked up these gigantic castings and set them down on their foundations. But before they did that complex, they did a building to show what they could do. So you can see the sort of units. There's one here, one there, one there. Notice the address. It's in your town. Are you afraid to see what it looks like today? There it is. So you can see the overhang there is the overhang here, and there's the window placement there. But any acknowledgement of the really out there, and I can only imagine, you have I think it's the Phoenix House right next door. I can only imagine how stark this must have been next to that historic home in the center of your village. But nonetheless, that sort of unique design and history has largely been lost to time, unfortunately. But, so they did this first, and they actually, their sort of elaborate steel mold, they actually set it out in front of the building and invited people in the newspaper to come by and see the work they'd done, inspect the mold, inspect the building made from the mold, and then from that they were able to garner enough interest to do a big test project with the Fairport Apartments. Here's a couple of photos from the advertisements of it. So you can see this is the movable factory here. Here's the 2 sort of gantry cranes above where the mold is at. You can see here's some workers. They're putting in various parts of the mold and assembling. We're putting in some reinforcing work. And now you can see the sort of the sides of the mold being tipped up into place with all the sort of internal formwork for the walls and the window openings. And then we cast the concrete on top, and then we just, easy, just pull it out and then set it back down. This is a great photo. So they just knocked the pin out. Now here's the monster mold, slowly opening to sort of release this massive casting to be picked up and set upon a foundation. Fortunately, these are a little slow. I mean, by virtue of the size of these castings, it took a little while to move them. So I'm not going to make you sit and watch it all the way. So they open up the casting, and then here's a photo sort of showing them maneuvering one into place here at the Fairport Apartments. So there's sort of the contraption of these giant front loaders that are holding this sort of massive casting, slowly moving it closer to where they're setting it down, and then they're going to lift it up and set it on top of the sort of first floor of this one. So word got around about this interesting man in Rochester, New York, who was doing these unbelievably large castings in concrete. And so this led to one of Jim's most exotic commissions, and that was he was contacted by the sort of royal family of Saudi Arabia to advise on the construction of pedestrian bridges to Mecca. The Italian masons were taking too long, and they weren't able to sort of figure out the sort of elaborate format they needed to make these sort of pedestrian bridges that wove through the historic city towards the sort of center sacred site. And so Jim was actually sort of flown out to Saudi Arabia and supervised from CCTV, because he was not of the Islamic faith, and so was an infidel, could not go into the sacred area, but was able to advise by TV. And then there's all these great photographs in the archives that show them out in the desert with these elaborate molds that he was sort of advising on the design and construction of to build the pedestrian bridges. There's a great sort of finished photograph, very dramatic, showing those wonderful, great units being lifted into place. Another one in your town, Brook Hill Village. Jim did do a series of multifamily housing, and so even, again, with something a little more typical like this, working for a developer that wasn't interested in doing something totally out there, you still have a little bit of drama here with this sort of very large, sort of large uneven roof form. And we saw a series of multifamily houses like this where he played a little bit with how you arrange the buildings around topography, if you sort of facet them along and layer them on the sort of the hills and dales of the site, and then have a little bit of fun with a sort of semi-dramatic roof shape that was still affordable to build. Probably the most notable of these projects is the Bay Village condominiums in Irondequoit. Sort of this one, you see this sort of get this great sort of faceting design where they sort of march down along the edge of the bay, and then to negotiate the slope of the site, there's actually sort of a two-tier parking garage built into the side where you're able to actually enter at ground floor up here and down there, and then sort of flow over to the upper units, which are not shown in this photo, on the other side of that sort of parking garage built into the hillside. This is so the original plan was actually much more grand for Bay Village, and included a sort of a golf course and a whole elaborate, a large building, club building, as well as a lot more condos than are there today. And then these are examples of other multifamily housing that he was involved in. He was involved in the first phase of Bristol Harbor Village, and then a couple of multifamily housing units in Canandaigua. And one of the more interesting ones was that he got involved with some of the region's large produce and apparel processors to provide migrant housing. There's actually 3 nearly identical complexes scattered throughout our region that are designed by Jim. There was a convoy of people from Albany that came to observe the conditions and were impressed with the sort of modern, sort of light-filled spaces that Jim had designed for these migrant workers. But it was a really sort of fascinating. They're not very ostentatious, but they are different if you notice them, and they're usually sort of buried towards a sort of canning plant, so they are kind of hard to see. We were only able to sort of photograph one from a distance, but we're able to see the other 2, at least in aerial imagery. They are still standing. They do look very similar to what the drawing showed. Unbuilt work. So this, I always got a giggle out of this project. So this is his what he called budget church, and it's listed in his project list as Project 100. It's his first project after establishing his new career. And he actually stamped these drawings, and I think that maybe after being a newly minted architect, he was so excited to design his first building that he made his own set of construction plans for a make-believe client, and stamp the drawings. But what's really beautiful about these is that they show a lot of design elements that you see in buildings that came after it. The sort of porte cochere design with this prow-like roof is very similar to St. John the Evangelist. The sort of the warp roof idea here, we have the sort of faceted structural members, a continuous skylight over the aisleway like we saw in Temple Sinai as well as the Norwegian House. And then sort of interesting enough, I don't think we have the photo of it in here, but as a proposal for Our Lady of Mercy Parish, he actually made a model of the budget church and made a model of the whole site with his other 3 buildings and plopped the church down just a little bit ways from the rectory to try and inspire them to, hey, why don't we do a 4th building on your site? But it never came to be, but it was neat sort of seeing a model version of his sort of his first project. Anyone know what this building is? It was a remodeling of a significant building in downtown. A significant building that is no longer around. Any guess? The Rochester train station. And I think this, along with a couple other projects that we came across, is also another interesting facet of Jim's career. So you may think with someone who's doing all this avant-garde architecture that he had no regard or respect for older architecture, because that was old, boring, traditional architecture. But Jim was actually very dismayed about the prospect of losing Claude Bragdon's sort of masterpiece, and made this design, sort of tried to campaign and drum up interest of, here's a proposal to reinvigorate and reinterpret the building but not lose it, because it would be a travesty to lose that building. We also have come across some buildings. He did a very beautiful little organ balcony in Brighton Presbyterian Church that you wouldn't even know had never been there. It looks like it just went right with the church, but it was designed by the man who did the Mushroom House. So Jim had an immense respect for the architects that preceded him, even though he was so sort of out there with his own designs. This is an unbuilt house that was scheduled for Pittsford. Rather interesting, so this long, but this sort of continuous clear store with these great sort of doubly curved roofs. This would have been the 7th Earthcast building, but it was not built. Katie and I call this the Onion House. This is supposed to be in Churchville, but you can see it's actually a melding kind of between the two. So we have this earthwork that actually remains, and then you cast this sort of onion-like roof with these sort of structural ribs on top of it, and then dig into the hill that you've created and create this wonderful sort of earthen bermed home overlooking the landscape. It would have been wonderful to have seen that built. Another great sort of spiraling irregular form, and we just kept coming across this over and over and over again. So he was a sort of boundless fount of creativity. This was a performing arts center. This is like in the early 1990s. Jim had a bit of whimsy and submitted a design for this performing arts center, and sort of thought it fun, why not make it a giant violin, make it a big instrument that you go inside to watch other instruments. I've always thought it was very neat and interesting. There's a lot of sort of thought about how he was dealing with the site, creating these outdoor spaces with this sort of sunken performance hall on the outside, this dramatic sort of glass atrium in between that sort of has a recital hall on one side and a grand concert hall on the other. But sort of great, sort of wonderful sort of whimsicalness to it. He also had a number of repeat clients. We're just going to touch on 2 of them. One was the Altiers family, so a lot of the Altiers shoe stores. If you have photos of old Altiers shoe stores, we want to talk to you because we can't find any except for this one. But Jim established a long-standing relationship with the Altier brothers and their shoe stores, and Jim and one of his artist collaborators, Carl Zolo, that we mentioned, the metalworker, he and Carl designed, I think, 12 Altier shoe stores together, and this is the interior of one of those 12. I can only imagine what the other 11 look like, but you know, the sort of amazing sort of sculpture to it. I believe this is probably spray foam like we saw on the house out in Naples, not concrete. But then we have this sort of metalwork intertwined to it, and then these sort of great modern Saarinen chairs arranged within it. And he also did a series of small additions for the Altiers brothers, but then did a full-fledged house for Richard Altier. This house recently was featured in an article in the DNC, I think last month. Sold before it listed. But it's a, you know, there's certainly there's some irregularity to the shape on the outside, but it doesn't sort of give away its secrets too readily on what's going on in the interior, where you have this beautiful multi-level space. And we saw this in some of Jim's later work with his residences, that if you didn't have this sort of ostentatious, you know, really Jim Johnson exterior, something he became very fascinated with his residential projects was dividing space by by elevation and not by wall. So you created these dramatic multi-level spaces with sort of ascending staircases or staircases weaving between different programmatic uses. We saw it time and time again. We saw a house from the 1980s out in Ontario that's very much like this. I think 7 different floor levels, all sort of open to one another. And so this is just one example of it. But you can see the staircase that sort of weaves itself between these public and private spaces, sort of looking out onto one another. And then, so the other repeat client that he had was James Bailey. He did 3 houses for Bailey, as well as many significant additions to his factory, the hardwood house furniture. So Bailey was sort of head of that. So this was the first house they did out in Pittsford. It was for sale recently. This is sort of the interior of it. So it's a little more what I would call, this would be a house that Don Hershey would be proud of. But a little tame for Jim, but still, beautifully modern, great open space. Some reoccurring materials like these granite blocks you may have seen in a lot of his projects. He seemed to like that material. We're using cedar again, but now it's vertical siding instead of the individual shingles. Bailey House number 2 in Pittsford. This is sort of interesting. It's sort of a colony of pyramids arranged around one another in different sizes according to their program. The largest one has the sort of the main living spaces in it and is opened up to that massive sort of pyramidal shape. And I think the whole ceiling is wood, if I remember correctly. But a very sort of dramatic space and very interesting house. And then last but not least, the sort of crowning achievement of that sort of 3-part series is the Bailey Residence in California. Before I show you more great photos, I'm going to go ahead and tell you the bad news. It was lost in a wildfire in 2008. But nonetheless, a gorgeous house, had a beautiful asymmetrical composition of all these great curved and irregular surfaces, creating a lot of dramatic space, and it overlooked the ocean, the Pacific Ocean in Santa Barbara, California. These are some photos in the interior. So the same method we talked about, these ascending spaces, where it's dividing programmatic use by elevation level. You can see how it sort of weaves up and around this sort of central area that has the sort of fireplaces run through it, a sort of chimney or structural column that pops out the roof out here on the outside. And then just a quick overview of some later work. Don't want to hold you too long. So this is what's called the Architecture 83 house. If you've never been, because everyone always asks me where it's at, so I'm just going to go ahead and tell you. If you've never been to Partridge Hill, I think it's Partridge Hill Lane in Honeyway Falls, go. It was a one-time only event that was arranged by Jean France, the Memorial Art Gallery, and a couple others, where they hired essentially every leading architect in Rochester in 1983 to design one house on the street. And so Jim has a house there. This is the house that he designed for it. Bud DeWolf, who was another sort of remarkable architect from that time, has one. Bob Macon and Anne Chantrell, who were also remarkable architects, have a house there. And it's just one after the others. There's like 10 houses. Each of them are bespoke. Each of them was designed by a leading architect of their era. Partridge Hill, and it's in Honeyway Falls. This is the house I mentioned that we saw out in Ontario. So it's this interesting sort of geometric, sort of almost abstract composition to it, but it has these sort of beautiful ascending levels on the interior. This is a house from the early 2000s that the airplane house I showed you earlier. So another repeat client that he had that he didn't sort of show one after the other was that original client for the airplane house. Their daughters contracted Jim to build houses for them. There's actually a family compound of 3 Jim Johnson houses all on the same property. And so this is the third one built, the first one being the airplane house, and the second one I don't have a photo of for you. This is probably his sort of largest and sort of most expensive home out in Macedon. This is it sort of overlooks the village of Macedon. The owner sort of owns the whole hilltop. I always admired it as a kid because I always saw this sort of copper roof sort of hanging out over the hillside. And what's really interesting is that they designed this whole roof similar to like a Frank Lloyd Wright house. There's massive steel beams that go in, and that whole roof just sort of hangs out there. And this sort of decorative wood element that you see here looks like a tree. That's not really doing anything structural. It's just sort of decorative element to break up the glass. But the whole roof is just sort of hanging out in space with nothing but glass beneath it. And then this is this house from the early 90s. This was a retreat sort of cottage out near Sodas Point that has a sort of beautiful sort of layered triangular geometry over the top of it. This is a house from the early 2000s or 1990s out in Massachusetts. And then last but not least, his last fully built work in 2009, 2010 was the house he co-designed with his daughter Betsy, just outside of Pittsford. And these are sort of some interiors like grand spiral staircase and then a beautiful sort of pure sort of spiral roof above. So I always like to end on this. This is a great photo. This is Jim working on site, always hands-on. This is when they were doing the addition to the Mushroom House. So they made a sort of bermed earthwork casting for the 2002 addition. Instead of making the house up on stilts, they built the house into the hillside for the addition. And so here he is hand sculpting the dirt and sand molds that they cast upon to make that addition in 2002. And with the quote, this is from Jim, "I've always enjoyed the ability to seek a new way of doing things. I've never really stuck to a style. I generally try to make every building stand on its own 2 feet, be in itself its own creation." Jim Johnson. Thank you for coming. Do we have time for any questions? A couple minutes. So yeah, we'll take a couple questions for Katie and I. If anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. We'll try to get through a couple. In the back?
Yeah, did you say there was a treehouse structure that you built?
So that was in reference to the Cates house. So I just referenced it because it feels like a tree house because you're sort of up in the trees. I don't know if I'll be able to get to it. But that was a sort of house up on stilts. But the way it feels is that when you're up on the 3rd level, it's a small platform with a little built-in bookcase behind you. Not much room for like more than 2 chairs and a coffee table. And you have the glass in front of you with this low railing overlooking the living room 20 feet below. And you're surrounded by trees. So you feel like you're in a tree house. But it's not a separate structure.
Okay, it reminded me of the idea I had for saving the growth, forest growth on a plot of land where they want to build a house. In other words, it would also use recycled materials, and a lot of the posts that would be used to stabilize the tree that the tree house is going to go around on the inside of those posts would be shaped like a tree.
Okay, thank you. And another question?
I don't
Sarah.
have a question. I was just going to say that Chris hit it right on the nail. Jim was an unorthodox architect in that he was involved with the construction of his buildings, and he knew how to build them. And I did have, when St. John Evangelist was being built, the construction manager from the contracting company told me aside, and he said, "I do worry about your husband because I've never worked with an architect that climbs around on a roof." He said, especially that roof, which was curving and going every which way. And then I saw him, I hadn't seen this, but I saw him put on a platform and get lifted to the top of the Liberty Pole, 200 feet, to check on, see if the Indians, they had the Native Indians and Native American from Tonawanda were setting, because the Liberty Pole is in, I think, 4 sections.
Right, yeah.
And the top one, he had to have it right, and he was on this platform that I don't think had anything on it, but he was lifted 200 feet. And I just saw this recently, and I said, that was Jim going up. He loved his work, and he was going to be a part of it from start to finish.
Yeah, and you may have noticed in some of those videos, they were not wearing hard hats for most of those. So it was definitely dangerous. We kind of suspected, and I don't know if we asked you, Sarah, if you kind of maybe encouraged him to stop doing some of those dangerous things.
Or she didn't know.
Yes.
I just wonder where all your research is going to wind up. Are you going to do a book?
Yes. This is one of our most common questions, actually. I have a copy of our report. So we were doing this as kind of according to a certain kind of technical style that we had to do a report. We are talking with RIT Press about possibly doing a book. We would love to do that. And especially because the Johnson family's been so generous that we have all these incredible historic photos that you don't usually get to have a resource like that. So I think a book that was just almost just the photos would be pretty amazing. But you know, they want the text to be a little less technical than what we have, a little more narrative. So we're going to be talking to them, you know, over the next few months to figure out what might be possible. Because it's nice to hear that question every time that people are interested in this. So.
And then I was going to add one more thing on that same thread, is that not necessarily with the report, but with Jim's work, is that, so I want to say maybe 15 years ago, Jim initially donated a small cache of drawings to U of R rare books to be preserved sort of in perpetuity. And when interest developed around the project when we finished, U of R is currently in talks with us and the Johnson family about trying to acquire the entirety of Jim's archives to try to move them over to U of R. So it's still in very, very early stages. I think we actually have a meeting coming up pretty soon over at the office to talk about it. But there is growing interest in trying to do our best to preserve and celebrate the unique legacy that Jim has for our region. Sarah, you had something?
Well, I was just going to say that Jim had no sons and he had no brothers, and Christopher Brandt was just a marvel for him. They developed a wonderful relationship. They were respectful of each other, and Jim loved to hear about anything new in architecture, and I know Chris liked to hear what was older stuff.
Yeah. It was fun bringing him to school. Yeah,
A wonderful friend, and Katie too has, but I picked on Chris because Jim had no men in his life. And here he has found such a nice person, plus he's an architect.
Right. But my little comment about bringing him to school, so I first became aware of Jim's work in college. And so I was able to entice him to come to Buffalo to give a lecture at the Buffalo School of Architecture. And it was like a standing room only sort of auditorium to see his talk. And Jim was just sort of going through slides and going through some of the footage that you saw and just sort of talking about this and the other thing. And just like all the professors' faces, they like picked their jaws up off the floor. They couldn't believe that this was just sort of going on in their backyard. And he was being sort of littered with questions of like, how could you possibly do this building? How'd you do it? And Jim was just sort of very modest and just said, well, I just really love concrete, and we just kind of did it. I just like couldn't believe that. Take maybe one more question. Last one, all right.
When you made these buildings, did you put gutters on them? How did you get rid of the water?
I'll let Chris answer that, but I actually do another talk about modern architecture. And the first time I did it, the first question someone said was, is there a correlation between modern buildings and leaky roofs? Well, there probably is. I'll let Chris answer it more technically.
So a lot of the more typical houses, some of the tamer designs that we sort of showed, a lot of those sort of had gutters. But if you have those sort of very large overhanging roofs, when you get far enough out from the foundation, there isn't as much of a concern for the water. For some of the large like church roofs, those all have gutters, because you can imagine the volume of water coming off of that roof. He wasn't just going to plow it all down there into the like porte cochere there on St. John the Evangelist. So there are gutters. Some of the houses that have those larger overhangs, like the Schwartz House. I don't think the Schwartz House has gutters except for maybe just over the garage, so you don't sort of get dripped on your head, because that's one area where the roof is not so broad in its overhang. And then obviously the Mushroom House does not have gutters. It's sort of this raw concrete structure out in the woods, and no need for silly little gutters. Okay, thank you everyone for coming.